Dear friends of Greek mythology, welcome to all who find comfort in ancient tales and timeless whispers from Mount Olympus. Tonight, we gather once more beneath the vast tapestry of stars that have witnessed every story since the beginning of time. Stars that sparkle like divine forge fires in the cosmic workshop above. We come together to explore the sacred narratives that have echoed through millennia. Stories that speak to something deep within our souls. Stories that carry the gentle wisdom of ages past like soft breezes through olive groves, like the patient whisper of waves against ancient shores in the depths of Mount Olympus, where starlight filters through clouds of silver and gold, where the very air shimmers with divine presence, and every breath tastes of ambrosia and possibility. There burns an eternal flame that never dims, never falters, never ceases its gentle dance. This flame has burned since before the cosmos took its current form, fed by woods that grew in places that no longer exist, tended by hands that understand the sacred nature of transformation. This is the forge of the gods, and within its warm embrace dwells a story of creation, of beauty born from solitude, of divine hands that shape wonder from raw elements as easily as a potter shapes clay, yet with infinitely more purpose and skill. The warmth from this eternal forge spreads throughout all creation, touching every smithy, every workshop, every place where the miracle of making occurs. It whispers in the flames of mortal forges, dances in the spark of inspiration, glows in the satisfaction of work well done. Tonight, we will trace this warmth back to its source, back to the God who tends the eternal flame, who transforms the raw stuff of chaos into objects of beauty and purpose. Before we begin our journey into this ancient tale, before we step across the threshold between our mortal world and the realm of gods and heroes, if you enjoy these quiet explorations through mythological realms, feel free to subscribe to Greek Myths for sleep and leave a gentle like. Your support helps these soothing stories reach others who seek the same peaceful rest that you do tonight. Others who find comfort in these ancient tales, who understand that wisdom often comes wrapped in the gentle cloth of story. Let us now step softly into the world of immortals, where time moves like honey through an hourglass made of crystallized starlight, where dreams take physical form as easily as thoughts, and where the boundary between the possible and impossible dissolves like morning mist before the sun. The story begins, as many divine tales do, in the halls of highest heaven, where the air itself pulses with power, and even the stones remember the birth of the universe. Here, a mother's love became twisted by divine complexities that mortals can scarcely comprehend, and a father's wrath manifested with the force to shake the very foundations of heaven. High upon Olympus, where marble halls catch the first light of dawn and hold it like captured butterflies made of pure radiance, where the last whispers of dusk linger in corners carved from clouds and solidified moonbeams, where every surface reflects not just images, but possibilities. Hera held her newborn son. The queen of gods stood in her private chambers, a room that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously, decorated with tapestries that showed past, present, and future, woven together in patterns that would drive mortal minds to madness with their beauty. She was draped in robes that contained the patterns of peacock feathers, each eye holding a different universe, the fabric shifting between the deep blue of midnight skies and the purple of royal authority. Her crown, forged by the Cyclopes in the first days after the Titanomachy, hummed with barely contained power, each gem a crystallized prayer from the mortals who worshipped her. She looked upon the child with eyes that saw past, present, and future in a single glance, eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of ages, that had seen titans bound and cosmos ordered. But something in what she saw stirred unease in her immortal heart, a disquiet that rippled through the fabric of reality itself. The child was different from the perfection usually born to immortals, a foot that turned inward like a question mark, features that lacked the symmetrical beauty common to divine offspring, a cry that spoke more of determination than divinity. Some say it was simply his appearance that disturbed her, for the gods, despite their wisdom, could be as vain as peacocks, as shallow as puddles that reflect only surfaces. But others, those who have studied the ways of immortals through dream and vision, whisper of deeper reasons. Perhaps it was prophecy that troubled her, visions of a future where this child would play a role she could not control, where his creations would shift the balance of power in ways even Zeus could not foresee. The fates had been strangely silent about this child's thread in their tapestry, and silence from the Moirai often spoke louder than their pronouncements. Still others speak of pride, that most dangerous of divine attributes, the poison that had brought low titans and would, in ages yet to come, trouble gods and mortals alike. Or perhaps it was simply the complicated tapestry of divine emotion that mortals can never fully understand, woven as it is from threads of power, jealousy, love, and fear, in proportions unknown to human hearts. The gods feel as mortals do, but their emotions are to human feelings as hurricanes are to summer breezes, as ocean depths are to puddles. Whatever the reason, whatever complex calculation of divine psychology led to the moment, Hera made her choice. She strode to the edge of Olympus, to the very precipice where the mountain of the gods meets the void, where reality grows thin and the boundaries between worlds flutter like veils in a cosmic wind. The other gods, sensing something momentous, gathered at a distance, watching with the fascination of those who witness fate in motion. Zeus was notably absent, attending to some cosmic duty, or perhaps simply avoiding the domestic drama that so often erupted in his household. His absence would later become part of the story, another thread in the complex weave of divine relationships. Some say he knew what would happen and chose not to intervene, seeing in this moment a necessary pain that would lead to greater glory. Others claim he was truly ignorant, and his rage upon learning of his son's fate shook the foundations of the universe. From the heights of heaven, from the very peak of Olympus, where the air was so pure it could burn mortal lungs, where each breath contained the essence of eternity, the infant fell like a shooting star. But this was no ordinary fall. It was a descent through layers of reality itself. The child tumbled through the realm where thoughts become things, through the layer where time moves in spirals rather than lines, through spaces where color has sound and music has texture. His descent lasted a day and a night by mortal reckoning, though in the strange physics of a god falling from heaven, it might have been moments or centuries. He fell through the aurora borealis that paints the northern skies, and forever after those lights would dance a little differently, as if remembering his passage. He tumbled through clouds where the Nephili, the cloud nymphs, tried to catch him, but found their airy forms insufficient to stop a god's momentum. He passed through the realm where rain is born, and his tears mixed with the drops, ensuring that somewhere in every storm there would be a note of divine sorrow. The other gods watched from their palaces and peaks, some with horror painting their perfect features, some with the indifference that comes from immortality. And having seen too much, Athena, wise beyond measure, began calculating trajectories and outcomes, seeing in this fall the birth of something necessary. Apollo, whose sight-pierced veils, both temporal and physical, hummed a dirge that would later become a lullaby. Artemis, wild and free, felt a kinship with this cast-out child and vowed to remember. Even Ares, usually concerned only with conflict, felt a strange stirring, recognizing perhaps a fellow outsider in the making. The fall was witnessed by more than just Olympians. Eagles circling the highest peaks veered away from the falling star that was not a star. The Oreads, mountain nymphs who made their homes on Olympus' lower slopes, sang lamentations that echoed through valleys and across peaks. The winds themselves, commanded by Aeolus, tried to slow the descent, but divine will, once set in motion, is not easily deterred. As the infant fell toward the wine-dark sea below, his divine nature began to manifest in subtle ways. The metal ornaments on his swaddling clothes grew warm and began to reshape themselves, forming protective shells around his most vulnerable parts. His cries, which had started as the wails of any abandoned child, began to carry harmonics that resonated with the fundamental frequencies of creation. This was divinity asserting itself, ensuring survival, beginning the transformation from victim to victor that would define his existence. The sea, vast and ancient, mother of mysteries and keeper of secrets, recognized what approached. Poseidon, lord of waves, felt the disturbance and turned his attention from his palace beneath the waters. He could have intervened, could have commanded the waters to part, could have returned the child to Olympus with all the fury of tsunami and tempest. But he too saw the threads of fate spinning, understood that this fall was necessary, that from this abandonment would come something the cosmos needed. So instead, he sent subtle commands through the currents, ensuring that the child would fall where kindness waited, where ancient hearts would recognize divine suffering and respond with compassion. The sea caught him with arms softer than silk, with waves that cradled rather than crushed. Each droplet of spray that touched the infant's skin carried within it a tiny blessing, a fragment of oceanic power that would forever after make him friend to waters, both salt and fresh. The impact that should have destroyed even a divine child was cushioned by waters that had been prepared for this moment since the world's foundation. The Mediterranean, that sea of myths and heroes, that body of water which has witnessed more divine intervention than any other, received him like a mother receiving a hurt child. The very salt in the water, formed from the tears of ancient titans, recognized a kindred sorrow and provided comfort. There, in the cool embrace of the depths, where sunlight becomes cathedral rays of blue and green, where pressure should crush, but instead embraces, where silence is so complete it becomes a different kind of sound. Two beings of infinite grace and ancient kindness found him. They had been drawn by currents, both physical and metaphysical, by the pull of fate and the push of compassion, by the songs the sea itself was singing about this divine foundling. Thetis of the silver feet, she who could change her form like water changes its shape, she who would one day mother the greatest of mortal heroes, arrived first. Her form shifted as she moved, now dolphin, now woman, now something between and beyond both. Her eyes held depths that had seen the ocean's birth, that knew secrets spoken only in the abyss where light has never touched. She had loved and lost, had known the pain of prophecy that cannot be avoided, and perhaps she recognized in this infant another whose fate would be both glorious and painful. Eurynome of the flowing waters, daughter of the Titan Oceanus, older than Olympians, older than the current ordering of the cosmos, arrived moments later. Where Thetis was quicksilver and change, Eurynome was ancient stability, the bedrock beneath ocean floors, the currents that had flowed since water first separated from land. Her hair moved like kelp in invisible tides. Her skin held the phosphorescence of deep-sea creatures. Her voice, when she spoke, was the sound of waves on shores that no longer existed. Together, they discovered the crying infant among the coral gardens that grew in fantastic formations. Each coral a different color from any mortal ocean could produce purples that held starlight, blues that remembered sky before sky existed, reds that pulsed with divine heartbeats. The child had landed in a grove of these living jewels, and already they were responding to his presence, growing in new patterns, reaching toward him like flowers toward sun, their hearts vast as the ocean itself, deeper than Mariana's trenches, both literal and metaphorical. Knew compassion as intimately as they knew the secrets of underwater currents and the language of whales, without hesitation, without the need for discussion that lesser beings might require. They gathered the child into their arms. Thetis wrapped him in kelp that glowed with soft bioluminescence, each strand a fiber optic cable carrying light from sources unknown. Eurynome sang to him songs that had soothed leviathans in the world's youth, melodies that predated music as mortals understood it, rhythms that matched the pulse of tides and the breathing of the earth itself. They bore him deeper, to realms where even gods rarely ventured, where water became something more than liquid, where the boundaries between states of matter grew fluid as the medium through which they moved. Their destination was a palace that existed partially in the physical ocean and partially in the realm of ideal forms, a place where concept and reality met and mingled like converging currents for 9 years, and the number was significant, being thrice 3, being the period of gestation taken to its mystical completion. In caverns beneath the waves that seemed carved from single pearls the size of mountains, where schools of fish painted living murals with their synchronized swimming, creating art that existed for moments before dissolving into new configurations, where dolphins played in currents warm as summer rain, while their laughter echoed in frequencies that healed hearts. The young god grew. The palace of the sea nymphs defied mortal understanding of architecture. Rooms existed that were larger inside than outside, chambers that opened onto vistas of other times and places, windows that looked out onto seas of other worlds, where water was made of different elements entirely. The walls were living mother of pearl that responded to emotion, shifting through spectrums of iridescence based on the moods of inhabitants. Furniture grew from the floor like coral formations, but soft as clouds, reshaping itself to provide perfect comfort. In the central courtyard, if such a term could apply to a space that existed underwater, yet somehow contained air and sky, grew a garden unlike any other. Anemones, the size of trees, swayed in currents that should not have existed, their tentacles creating wind chimes of pure harmony. Fish swam through the airwater, their scales leaving trails of light that lingered like aurora. Plants grew that were animal and mineral, and something altogether other, categories of existence that mortals had no words for. The sea nymphs raised him with tender care that never wavered, never questioned, never demanded explanation for its own existence. They taught him through example and experience rather than lecture. From Thetis, he learned the patience of tides that know they will eventually wear down even the hardest stone. That persistence is not stubborn assault, but consistent presence. She would take him to underwater cliffs where water had carved impossible sculptures over millennia, showing him how the softest substance could shape the hardest given time and dedication. From Uranome, he learned the deeper currents of existence, the flows of power that moved beneath surface reality. She taught him to see the connections between all things, how the movement of a single fish could influence currents that would become storms half a world away. Under her tutelage, he began to understand that creation was not imposing will upon material, but finding the harmony between maker and made, discovering what the material wanted to become, and helping it achieve that potential. Their teaching methods were as unusual as their dwelling. They would take him to underwater volcanoes where lava met water in violent creation, showing him how from conflict could come new land, new possibilities. They introduced him to the deep-sea creatures that made their own light, teaching him that darkness was not absence, but opportunity. That limitation could spark innovation. He met ancient things that had no names, beings that existed before the current ordering of elements, and from them learned that creation preceded categorization, that making came before naming. The child showed early signs of his divine nature and specific gifts. By the time he could walk, and his twisted foot gave him a rolling gait like the motion of waves, he was already arranging things with purpose. He would spend hours sorting shells, not by size or color, but by some system comprehensible only to him, creating patterns that the nymphs would later realize were three-dimensional representations of mathematical principles that mortal philosophers would not discover for millennia. His hands, even as a toddler, showed unusual dexterity and strength. He could hold things that should have been too heavy for his small frame, could manipulate objects with precision that spoke of divine inheritance. But more than physical capability, he showed an intuitive understanding of materials. He knew without teaching which shells would break under pressure, and which would hold, which stones could be shaped, and which would crumble, which metals would blend, and which would reject each other like oil and water. The sea provided abundant materials for his early experiments. Ships had been sinking in these waters since mortals first learned to bind wood and brave waves, and their cargoes accumulated in certain currents like offerings to an underwater god. Bronze from Phoenician traders, iron from peoples whose names were lost to history, gold from kingdoms that existed now only in dreams, silver from mines that had been exhausted before the current age began. All these and more found their way to the young god's workplace, but he didn't just use metals. He worked with everything the sea provided, bones of sea monsters that had died in ages past, scales from fish that swam in waters, both physical and metaphysical, pearls that formed in oysters exposed to divine radiance, corals that grew in patterns determined by music rather than biology. He learned that every material had its own nature, its own desires, its own potential waiting to be unlocked. His first creation that could truly be called divine came when he was 5 by mortal reckoning. Though time flowed strangely in the palace beneath waves, he had been playing with bits of bronze from a sunken ship, heating them in underwater volcanic vents that Eurynome had taught him to use safely. The nymphs expected him to make simple shapes, perhaps a rough blade or a crude ornament. Instead, he created a fish of bronze that swam. It was not large, no bigger than his child's hand, and its movement was simple, a basic undulation that propelled it through water, but it swam with purpose, with what could only be called will. It would follow him through the palace, rest when he rested, circle anxiously when he was upset. The nymphs recognized what they were seeing, not just craftsmanship, not just divine power, but the ability to breathe something like life into inanimate matter. This was the moment they knew with certainty what domain this child would claim. Other gods commanded elements, ruled concepts, embodied forces. But this child would be the maker, the shaper, the one who stood at the intersection of thought and thing, of idea and object. He would be the bridge between the conceptual and the physical, the translator of divine will into tangible form. From that day forward, his education became more focused. Thetis brought him texts that existed nowhere else, manuals written by the Telchins, those ancient craftsmen who had forged Poseidon's trident and then been cast into the sea for their hubris. The texts were written in languages that preceded speech, in symbols that conveyed meaning directly to the mind. They spoke of alloys that could only be made in the heart of stars, of temperatures that existed in the gaps between moments, of tools that shaped possibility itself. Eurynome took him deeper into the ocean than he had ever gone, to places where pressure would crush even divine flesh, if not properly protected. Here lived things that had survived from previous iterations of reality, beings that remembered when fire and water were one element, when earth and air had not yet separated. From them, he learned techniques that had no names because they preceded the need for naming, ways of working with matter that ignored the laws physics would later claim were inviolable. He met Proteus, the shape-shifting old man of the sea, who taught him that form was negotiable, that the shape of a thing was just one of its many possible expressions. He learned to see objects not as fixed entities, but as paused possibilities, moments of stability in an eternal dance of transformation. This understanding would later allow him to create items that could change based on need, that were not locked into single functions, but could adapt as required. The Nereids, 50 daughters of Nereus, became his playmates and assistants. Each had her own personality, her own gifts, and he learned to create things that pleased each one. For Galatea, who loved all things bright, he made jewelry that captured bioluminescence and released it in controlled patterns. For Amphitrite, who would later marry Poseidon, he crafted a crown of coral and pearl that would grow more beautiful the deeper she swam. For Thetis' sisters, he made gifts tailored to their natures, nets that would always catch what was sought, mirrors that showed truth beneath surface, combs that could untangle more than just hair. As he grew older and his skills developed, his workshop expanded from a simple corner of the palace to a complex of caves and chambers dedicated to different crafts. One chamber, heated by volcanic vents, became his primary forge. Another, cooled by currents from the Arctic, became his place for working with materials that required cold. A third, where fresh and salt water mingled, became his laboratory for creating new alloys, for discovering combinations that had never existed before. His automation began simply mechanical fish that would sort materials, bronze crabs that could hold pieces while he worked on them, but they grew in complexity as his understanding deepened. By his 8th year, he had created helpers that could perform basic forging tasks, allowing him to work on multiple projects simultaneously. These were not just tools, but companions, each with quirks and personalities that emerged from their creation. One, a bronze octopus he called Polypus, became particularly dear to him. It had 8 arms that could each perform different tasks. One optimized for holding, another for hammering, a third for detail work, and so on. But more than its utility, it developed what could only be called affection for its creator. It would bring him particularly interesting pieces of metal it found, would arrange his tools in patterns that pleased the eye, would even attempt to create simple objects on its own when he wasn't watching. The underwater palace became known among the denizens of the deep as a place of wonders. Sea creatures would gather to watch him work, drawn by curiosity and the strange energies released by divine crafting. Schools of fish would swim in patterns that matched his hammer strokes, creating living mandalas that pulsed with the rhythm of creation. Whales would sing harmonies to the ringing of metal on metal, their songs carrying news of the young craftsmen to the far corners of the ocean. Even the structure of the palace itself began to change in response to his presence. Rooms reshaped themselves to better suit his needs. Walls developed veins of precious metals that grew like living things. Floors became workbenches when needed. The palace was becoming not just his home, but an extension of his divine nature, a living workshop that participated in the act of creation. His relationship with the nymphs deepened from mere fostering to true family. Thetis, who knew the pain of prophecy, for she had learned that any son she bore to a mortal would be greater than his father saw in Hephaestus, a different kind of child, one whose greatness would come not from war or kingship, but from the fundamental act of making. She loved him with the fierce protectiveness of one who has known loss, teaching him not just craft, but survival, not just skill, but wisdom. Eurynome, ancient beyond measure, saw in him echoes of the first makers, the beings who had shaped reality from chaos in the universe's youth. she shared with him memories that were not quite her own, inherited recollections of the time when creation was not separate from creator, when the act of making was itself a form of being. Under her tutelage, he learned that every act of creation was a cosmogony in miniature, a recapitulation of the universe's birth. As his 9th year in the underwater realm drew to a close, both nymphs knew that change was coming. He had grown beyond what their realm could teach, needed materials and challenges that the ocean, vast as it was, could not provide. But they also knew he could not simply appear on Olympus as a supplicant, begging for recognition from those who had cast him out. He needed to return on his own terms, as an equal rather than a child seeking acceptance. Together, they planned his return like master strategists, preparing for a campaign that would be won not through force, but through awe. For months, Hephaestus worked on special projects, pieces that would serve as his calling cards to the world above the waves. But these were not mere gifts. They were statements, arguments made tangible, proofs of divinity expressed in metal and stone. The throne for Hera was the centerpiece of his plan, but it was far from the only wonder he created. For Zeus, though he did not know if the king of gods had approved his fall or merely allowed it, he created a scepter that would amplify divine will, that would make commands spoken while holding it impossible to disobey. But only if those commands were just. It was a gift that appeared to increase power while actually imposing wisdom. A subtle reminder that authority came with responsibility. For each Olympian, he crafted something that spoke to their nature while gently suggesting improvement. For Apollo, a lyre that would play harmony to any melody, teaching the god of music that even his solos could benefit from accompaniment. For Artemis, arrows that would always find their mark, but would turn to flowers if aimed at the innocent, honoring her as huntress while protecting her from unjust kills. For Athena, a helmet that would show the wearer all possible outcomes of their strategies, wisdom enhanced by foresight. But the greatest work was the throne intended for his mother. For weeks he labored over it, pouring into its creation all his complex feelings, the abandonment, yes, but also understanding, the pain, but also the strength that pain had forged. He worked metals that had never been alloyed before, combining gold from the sun's corona with silver from the moon's dark side, adding metals that fell from stars and rose from the earth's core. Every surface told a story, but the stories were layered, changing based on viewing angle and the heart of the viewer. From one perspective, it showed Hera's glory and power, her victories and triumphs. From another, it revealed the costs of those victories, the loneliness of power, the weight of queenship. It was judgment and forgiveness, accusation and understanding, all woven together in metal too complex for any but divine eyes to fully appreciate. The binding mechanism was his masterwork of engineering. Not crude chains or obvious restraints, but something far more subtle, threads of force that would respond to divine will, that would hold fast against struggle, but yield to acceptance. It was a trap that could only be escaped by acknowledging what it represented, by accepting the truth it presented. He built into it not just his own pain, but his transcendence of that pain, not just accusation, but the possibility of reconciliation. When the time came for his ascension, the sea itself participated in his departure. Currents that had not aligned for millennia came together, creating a column of water that rose from ocean to clouds. Sea creatures gathered in numbers, not seen since the world's youth, whales singing farewell songs, dolphins leaping in celebration, fish schooling in patterns that spelled out blessings in languages only the sea knew. He rose from the depths on a chariot that was itself a contradiction resolved, a vehicle meant for land that moved through water, pulled by hippocampi whose bodies were part horse, part fish, part something altogether other. The chariot's wheels turned on axles that existed partially in other dimensions, allowing movement through media that should have been impossible. Its body was covered with scenes from his underwater youth, memories made metal, gratitude given form. Behind him came a procession of his creations, not just the gifts for the gods, but examples of his art for its own sake, sculptures that moved with their own purpose, jewelry that enhanced the beauty of emptiness itself, weapons that could wound concepts as easily as flesh, tools that built themselves, instruments that played the music of the spheres. Each piece was carried by automation he had created, and the automation themselves were part of the display, showing that he could breathe purpose into purposeless matter. Thetis and Eurynome accompanied him to the surface, their forms shifting between mortal appearance and divine reality. At the boundary between sea and sky, they paused for farewells that needed no words. Thetis pressed into his hands a small pearl, no larger than a tear, that contained within it the sound of every wave that had ever lapped ashore. Eurynome gave him a vial of the first water that had ever existed, useful for quenching metals in ways that would bind them to primal forces. Then he was rising through sky, the hippocampi's hooves finding purchase on solidified clouds, the chariot leaving a trail of rainbow mist that would later inspire mortal artists. The journey from sea to Olympus was not just physical, but metaphysical, passing through layers of reality that grew more refined as altitude increased. He passed through the realm of birds, and eagles circled him in recognition. He rose through the layer where weather was born, and lightning played around his chariot without striking, acknowledging a fellow child of sky. As he approached Olympus, the mountain of the gods revealed itself in its true glory, not just a peak of stone, but a concept of height made tangible, a place where up became in and earth became heaven. The lower slopes, where minor deities and spirits dwelt, burst into activity as news of his approach spread. Oreads emerged from their caves to witness this return. Dryads whispered the news from tree to tree, and the very stones seemed to pulse with anticipation. The gates of Olympus, wrought by the Cyclopes in the first days after the Titanomachy, opened without his touch. They recognized him not as the cast-out infant, but as a god in his own right, a master craftsman whose skills, perhaps, exceeded even their own. The automation that guarded the entrance, bronze giants with eyes of crystal, saluted as he passed, one creator acknowledging another. His arrival in the central court of Olympus caused the sensation he had intended. Gods who had lived for eons and seen wonders beyond counting stopped in their tracks. The gifts he had brought were displayed by his automation with a showmanship that would have made Apollo envious. Each piece was revealed at the perfect moment, with lighting that showed its best features, with positioning that made it impossible to ignore. Hermes, quickest of the gods, was first to approach, circling the displays with professional interest. As god of thieves, he appreciated craftsmanship that couldn't be stolen, items so perfectly made that even he couldn't find flaw or weakness. He laughed with genuine delight at a pair of sandals Hephaestus had made not winged like his own, but with soles that would never wear out, that would always find the most interesting path rather than just the quickest. Apollo came next, drawn by the lyre despite himself. When he touched its strings, the instrument harmonized with his divine nature, creating music that was both his and more than his. For a moment, the god of music looked vulnerable, understanding that his domain could be enhanced by another's craft. He nodded slowly, acknowledging mastery where he found it. Artemis approached her gift of transforming arrows with the wariness of a wild thing. But when she tested one against a practiced target, saw it strike true, then burst into moonflowers, her usual stern expression softened. She who had vowed never to marry or be possessed understood gifts that honored rather than sought to capture. Athena examined each piece with the intensity of one craftsperson appreciating another's work. She studied construction, analyzed techniques, traced the logic of creation. When she reached the helmet made for her, she put it on without hesitation and gasped at the visions it provided, not just strategy, but wisdom, not just victory, but understanding of victory's cost. She removed it slowly, looking at Hephaestus with new respect. But all of these were prelude to the main event. Hera, drawn by the throne's beauty like a moth to flame that doesn't know it burns, approached with regal bearing that betrayed no recognition of the maker. Her robes, which changed color with her moods, shifted through spectrums of purple and gold, indigo and silver, as she admired the craftsmanship. The peacocks that followed her everywhere spread their tails in display, as if competing with the throne's beauty. She circled it 3 times, as was her right as queen, examining every detail. From the first angle, She saw herself as she preferred to be seen, mighty, just, deserving of worship. From the second, she saw herself as others saw her, powerful, but sometimes petty, regal, but sometimes cruel. From the third angle, she saw something that made her pause herself as she could be, combining the best of both views while transcending their limitations. With words that gave no hint of recognizing the maker, she praised the unknown craftsman who had created such a wonder. She spoke of how Olympus had lacked proper thrones, how the gods had made do with seats unworthy of their status. She proclaimed that this throne would serve as exemplar, showing what divine furniture should be. And with the confidence of one who has never been truly trapped, she seated herself upon it. The transformation was instant but subtle. What happened next became legend even among the gods, a story told and retold with variations that grew with each telling. But the truth, witnessed by all present, was both simpler and more complex than any version that came after. The moment Hera's divine form made full contact with the seat, mechanisms of impossible delicacy activated. Not with the crude clank of mortal machinery, but with the whisper of divine will made tangible. Chains emerged not from hidden compartments, but from the very atoms of the air, materializing like condensing starlight. They were not harsh restraints, but works of art in themselves. Some appeared to be made of linked flowers that never wilted, others of musical notes given form, still others of crystallized emotions that shifted between colors, representing every feeling Hera had ever caused in others. The throne itself transformed, revealing layers of complexity that had been invisible moments before. What had seemed solid became permeable. What had appeared fixed became fluid. Golden bars emerged not violently, but with the inevitability of sunrise, growing from floor and ceiling and air itself to form a cage that was as beautiful as it was inescapable. Each bar was unique. One showed scenes from Hera's youth before she was queen. Another depicted every unjust punishment she had decreed. A third revealed every moment of genuine kindness she had shown. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect was how the binding responded to struggle. The harder Hera fought against it, the more comfortable it became, adjusting to her form with solicitous care that made resistance feel foolish. When she raged, the chains sang soothing melodies. When she tried to command her way free, they showed her visions of times her commands had caused unjust suffering. When she attempted to break them with divine strength, they absorbed the force and converted it to gentle warmth. Zeus' arrival was preceded by thunder that made the mountain tremble. The king of gods appeared in full majesty, crackling with barely contained lightning, his eyes holding storms. He had been attending to the eastern borders of reality, preventing chaos from seeping into ordered existence, when the disturbance on Olympus drew his attention. Seeing his wife imprisoned, his rage manifested as a thunderbolt that he hurled at the throne without hesitation. the bolt, which could have split mountains and boiled seas, simply vanished into the throne's structure. Where it struck, the gold gleamed brighter for a moment, as if saying thank you for the additional power. Zeus threw another, then another, each more powerful than the last, culminating in a blast that would have unmade lesser artifacts. The throne absorbed them all, using their energy to strengthen its bonds. Ares, god of war, attacked next with every weapon in his arsenal. Swords that had drunk the blood of titans shattered against the golden bars. Spears that had never missed their mark curved away at the last moment. His own divine strength, sufficient to wrestle mountains into new positions, couldn't budge a single link of the delicate-seeming chains. With each failed attempt, his frustration grew, but the throne seemed to feed on conflict, growing more serene the more violence was directed at it. Athena, wise in ways her brother was not, tried subtlety where force had failed. She examined every joint, every connection, every point where magic met metal. She spoke words of unmaking in languages that predated creation, wove spells of dissolution that could unmake concepts themselves. But the throne had been built by one who understood that wisdom, without experience, was merely theory. Each of her attempts revealed new layers of construction, new redundancies, new impossibilities resolved. Apollo attempted to melt it with the concentrated heat of the sun itself, calling down rays that turned the air to plasma. The throne remained cool to the touch, though the gold gleamed as if appreciating the attention. Artemis fired arrows that could pierce the veil between worlds, only to watch them transform to flowers the moment they touched the bars. Hermes tried to steal pieces of it, to disassemble it component by component, but found that each part existed as both itself and part of the whole, impossible to separate. Even Aphrodite, usually above such concerns, tried her own form of persuasion. She approached the throne with all her beauty unveiled, speaking words of such charm that stones would weep and stars would fall for love of her. The throne showed her its own beauty in response, a perfection of craft that existed independently of desire. And for perhaps the first time in her existence, the goddess of beauty encountered something immune to her primary power. It was then, when all the mighty Olympians had failed, when divine power had proven insufficient against divine craft, that Hephaestus revealed himself. He stepped forward from where he had waited in the shadows of a pillar, and the gods who had not seen him since his infancy gasped collectively. He had grown strong in his underwater exile, but it was not the brute strength of Ares or the perfect proportions of Apollo. His was the strength of purpose, muscles developed not for show, but for use. His arms, scarred from countless small burns and cuts that even divine flesh could suffer when pushing the boundaries of possibility, spoke of dedication beyond mere exercise. His hands, when he raised them, showed the calluses of honest work, badges of honor that no amount of ambrosia could erase. He walked with the limp that marked his fall from heaven, but he had transformed it into something uniquely his, where another might shamble or shuffle. He moved with a rolling gait that matched the rhythm of hammers on anvils, of waves on shores, of the eternal dance of creation. The supports he had crafted for himself were marvels of engineering that drew Athena's professional admiration. Not mere braces, but augmentations, turning disability into capability. His clothes were simple compared to the finery of other gods. Leather apron scarred by forgework, tunic that had seen better days, sandals worn smooth by workshop floors. But each piece was perfectly suited to its purpose, enchanted with protections and enhancements that spoke of practical magic rather than ostentatious display. He wore his craft like armor, his skill like a crown. When he raised his eyes to meet the gaze of the assembled gods, there was no anger there, only calm certainty. These were eyes that had stared into forge fires until they could judge temperature by color alone, that had examined countless flaws until they could spot imperfection at a glance, that had learned to see potential in raw materials. Now they saw potential in this moment, in this gathering of divine power brought low by divine craft. Release her, Zeus commanded, lightning playing between his fingers, threat implicit in every syllable. Hephaestus tilted his head, considering. When he spoke, his voice carried the depth of ocean trenches and the warmth of forge fires. She will be released, he said simply, when agreements are made. What followed was negotiation conducted with the patience of one who had learned metalwork, understanding that some things could not be rushed. Zeus raged and threatened, but Hephaestus simply waited, knowing that even the storm god would eventually exhaust himself against the implacability of patient craft. Offers were made treasure, power, position. But the young god wanted none of these things, or rather, wanted them only as recognition of what he already possessed. His terms, when he finally stated them, were simple in word, but complex in implication. Recognition as a true Olympian, not by sufferance, but by right. One of the 12 thrones of power, acknowledgement as equal to those who had cast him out. Workshops wherever he desired them, with no interference in his craft. The hand of Aphrodite in marriage, this last causing the greatest stir. For what could the lame craftsman want with the goddess of beauty? But Zeus, despite his rage, was no fool. He saw in this young god not just skill, but necessity. The thunderbolts that were his primary weapons had begun to show their age, their power diminishing with each use. Who else could forge new ones? The chains that bound the Titans in Tartarus needed maintenance that only a master smith could provide. The very infrastructure of Olympus, the mechanisms that kept it anchored to its mountain, that maintained its existence partially outside normal reality, required someone who understood how divine engineering worked. More than that, he recognized the justice in Hephaestus' requests. Here was a god who had been cast out for imperfection, who had survived and thrived despite that rejection, who had returned not as a beggar, but as a power in his own right. To deny him would be to deny the very meritocracy that Zeus claimed to champion. To refuse him would be to admit that Olympian power was based on appearance rather than ability. The marriage to Aphrodite was harder to accept, but Zeus saw the wisdom in it too. The goddess of beauty, wedded to the god of craft, would create a balance, a union of form and function that reflected cosmic principles. That the two seemed incompatible was perhaps the point. Reconciling opposites was, after all, part of what held reality together. One by one, the other Olympians voiced their agreement. Some, like Athena, did so eagerly, recognizing a kindred spirit in the craftsman god. Others, like Ares, acquiesced grudgingly, understanding that opposition was futile. Aphrodite herself remained silent, her expression unreadable, but she did not object when Zeus formally announced the betrothal. With the agreements made and witnessed by all for divine oaths, once spoken, could not be broken without consequences that rippled through reality, Hephaestus approached the throne. He did not gesture dramatically or speak words of power. He simply touched one of the golden bars with a scarred finger, and the entire structure sighed like a living thing, releasing a held breath. The chains dissolved not into nothingness, but into butterflies of metallic hues that had never been seen before. They circled Hera once, twice, 3 times, then dispersed through the windows of Olympus, carrying with them the message of what had transpired. The bars melted like ice in summer sun, but the liquid gold did not fall, it rose, forming clouds of metallic vapor that would later rain down as inspiration on mortal craftsmen. The throne itself transformed one final time, returning to its original beautiful but harmless form. But it was changed by what it had been, carrying now in its structure the memory of its dual nature. Forever after, anyone who sat in it would feel a gentle reminder of the danger of hubris, the cost of cruelty, the power of patient craft to humble even the mighty. Hera rose with as much dignity as she could muster, which was considerable. She was, after all, queen of the gods. Her robes settled around her in perfect folds, her crown straightened itself, her peacocks gathered at her feet. For a long moment, she stared at her son, this child she had cast away, who had returned as her equal. The air between them crackled with potential, with all the words that could be said, all the hurts that could be aired, all the reconciliations that might be possible. Then, in a moment that surprised all watching, she approached him and placed a hand upon his scarred cheek. No words were spoken. What words could encompass the complexity of their relationship? But something passed between them in that touch, not forgiveness, that would take longer than even immortals had, but understanding, recognition. perhaps even the first faint stirring of the pride she should have felt from the beginning. The wedding of Hephaestus and Aphrodite was celebrated with festivities that lasted a full turn of the moon, from new to full and back to new again. All of Olympus participated, even those who privately thought the match absurd. The muses composed songs that tried to capture the incongruity and deeper harmony of the union. The Graces danced patterns that spoke of beauty finding new forms, of love expressing itself through creation rather than just desire. Hephaestus himself crafted wonders for the celebration. Fountains that flowed with wine that could intoxicate gods without making them foolish. Fireworks that painted stories across the night sky. Flowers of metal that bloomed and faded in cycles that matched the music. He showed, through his preparations, that he understood beauty, even if he did not embody it in traditional ways. Aphrodite came to the ceremony wearing a girdle of her own design that made her beauty even more overwhelming than usual. But Hephaestus had prepared for this, wearing dark glasses of his own invention that allowed him to look upon her without being stunned into immobility. They were not mere smoked glass, but complex constructions that filtered divine radiance while still allowing true sight. Later, mortal craftsmen would dream of these glasses and wake with ideas for telescopes and microscopes, instruments for seeing what was too bright or too small for naked eyes. The ceremony itself was performed by Zeus, who spoke words that bound not just two gods, but two principles. As he spoke, the very air shimmered with power, reality adjusting itself to accommodate this new union. Where Aphrodite stood, flowers bloomed spontaneously. Where Hephaestus stood, the ground transformed to precious metals. Where they joined hands, the two effects met and merged, creating jewelry flowers that were both living and crafted, natural and artificial reconciled. Their wedding night was spent not in passionate embrace, but in his forge, a choice that caused much divine gossip, but suited both their natures. Hephaestus had prepared the space, cleaning it as it had never been cleaned, organizing tools with even more precision than usual, banking the fires to provide warmth without overwhelming heat. He showed her the wonders he could create, not as boasts, but as offerings, sharing with her the joy he found in making. He began with simple things, taking base metals and transforming them before her eyes into forms of increasing beauty. A lump of gold became a flower so realistic that its petals seemed to tremble in non-existent breezes. Silver flowed like water under his hands, becoming a miniature fountain that recycled its own flow eternally. Copper and tin met in marriage of their own, birthing bronze that sang with harmonic frequencies. For her part, Aphrodite watched with eyes that saw more than most gave her credit for. She was beauty incarnate, yes, but beauty requires understanding of form, proportion, harmony. She recognized in his movements the same principles that governed her own domain, the search for perfection, the drive to bring potential to fulfillment, the satisfaction of seeing raw material become what it was meant to be. As the night progressed, she began to participate, not in the actual crafting, that was his domain, but in the design. She would suggest a curve here, a proportion there, and he would incorporate her ideas into his work. Together, they created jewelry that didn't just adorn, but transformed the wearer. Weapons that were too beautiful to use in anger, tools that turned labor into art. By dawn, they had established the pattern their marriage would follow. It would not be the passionate romance of mortal tales, but it had its own warmth. She would visit his forge when the mood struck her, moving through smoke and heat without a single perfect hair displaced. He would create for her wonders that no other could conceive, let alone craft. They would work in companionable silence or animated discussion, finding common ground in their shared appreciation for beauty, even if they defined it differently. The forge that Hephaestus established beneath Olympus became one of the wonders of the divine realm. He carved it from the living rock of the mountain, but this was no crude excavation. He convinced the stone to reshape itself, to flow like water into forms that nature had never imagined. But that seemed, once complete, as if they had always existed. The main chamber was vast as a cathedral, its ceiling lost in shadows that flickered with reflected forge light, its floor worn smooth by divine footsteps and the passage of automation. 20 anvils of different sizes and materials stood ready for different types of work. One was pure silver, its surface never tarnishing, perfect for delicate work that required precision over power. Another was meteor iron, still carrying the cold of space within its core, ideal for working star metal. A third was made from crystallized sound itself, allowing him to forge items that incorporated harmonics into their very structure. Each anvil had its own personality, its own specialties, its own songs that rang out when struck. The forges themselves were marvels of divine engineering. The main forge connected directly to the primal fires at the earth's heart, providing heat that could melt any substance known to God or mortal. Secondary forges burned with different flames, cold fire that froze rather than heated, temporal fire that aged or renewed, conceptual fire that could burn away flaws in ideas themselves. He could adjust each forge's output with precision mortals wouldn't achieve for millennia, controlling not just temperature, but the very nature of heat itself. The tools arrayed on walls and benches defied counting or complete cataloging. Hammers that knew exactly how much force to apply, tongs that could hold both butterfly wings and mountain peaks with equal security, files that could remove imperfections too small for even divine eyes to see. But beyond, these were tools that had no mortal equivalent instruments for shaping possibility, for bending reality, for working with materials that existed only in potential until the moment of creation. The automation he created to assist him became increasingly sophisticated. The golden maidens who served as his primary assistants were indistinguishable from living beings, except for their metallic skin and the faint musical chiming of their movements. They anticipated his needs with prescience that might have been programming or might have been genuine intuition. They could work for centuries without rest, their golden bodies actually growing more beautiful with use as the patina of purpose developed. Bronze giants operated the massive bellows with rhythms that had become part of Olympus' soundscape. Their movements created a constant underlying beat that gave the forge a pulse like a living thing. These were not mere mechanical constructs, but beings with a kind of consciousness, able to adjust their rhythm to match the needs of whatever was being forged. They communicated with each other in languages of steam and percussion, coordinating their efforts without need for verbal commands. Silver servants, more delicate than their golden and bronze counterparts, handled the finished products with reverence. They polished and cleaned, sorted and stored, maintaining an inventory that existed both physically and in some metaphysical space where items could be retrieved instantly when needed. They moved through the forge like ghosts, their passage marked only by the faint musical chime of their footfalls and the sudden appearance of perfect organization where chaos had reigned moments before. But perhaps the most wondrous creations were the ones that had no human form at all. Tools that worked themselves, following the intention of the user rather than just their movements. Furnaces that could read the desires of the smith and adjust their heat accordingly. Quenching baths that knew exactly what properties to impart to hot metal. The forge itself became a participant in creation rather than just a location for it. The smoke from his forge rose through specially designed vents that spiraled through the mountain like great stone serpents. These vents did more than merely carry away smoke. They filtered and processed it, extracting any particles of precious metal that might have been vaporized, cooling and condensing them to fall like metallic snow in collection chambers. Nothing was wasted in the forge of Hephaestus, every atom of material finding its purpose eventually. The sound of his hammer became more than noise. It became a fundamental rhythm of Olympus, a heartbeat that reminded all who dwelt there that work continued always, that creation never ceased. The sound carried differently to different ears. Warriors heard in it the rhythm of marching armies, the beat of war drums, the clash of weapons. Lovers heard quickened heartbeats, the pulse of passion, the rhythm of union. Artists heard the beat of inspiration itself, the moment when idea becomes form. But for mortals who sometimes caught echoes of this divine percussion, it became something else entirely. They heard in it a call to create, to make, to improve. Smiths would find themselves working in rhythm with sounds they couldn't quite hear, their hammers falling in patterns that matched divine work. Artists would feel their hands moving to rhythms that came from nowhere and everywhere, creating works that surprised even themselves. In his forge, time moved according to its own rules. When deeply engaged in a project, Hephaestus could spend what felt like moments on work that actually took months. Conversely, he could stretch seconds into hours when precision required it, examining each stage of a process with attention that made time itself slow down. This flexibility of temporal flow allowed him to work on projects of complexity that would have been impossible in normal time. His relationship with fire deepened from tool use to true partnership. He could speak to flames in languages that predated words, could convince them to burn hotter or cooler, to consume or preserve, to transform or maintain. Each type of fire had its own personality. Forge fire was steady and reliable. Volcanic fire was passionate, but unpredictable. Stellar fire was pure, but alien. He learned to work with each type, understanding their needs as well as his own. This connection extended to metaphorical fires as well. The fire of inspiration that burned in artists' minds, the flame of passion that consumed lovers, the spark of life that animated all beings. These two fell within his influence. He became not just smith, but kindle of creativity itself, able to spark inspiration in mortals with a thought, to fan the flames of genius or bank the fires of destructive obsession. Among his most frequent divine visitors was Athena, whose own domain of crafts overlapped with his. They would work together on projects that required both strength and subtlety, power and precision. Their collaborations became legendary even among gods' weapons that could think, armor that could adapt, tools that taught their users how to improve. Their partnership was one of equals, each respecting the other's expertise, each learning from their different approaches. One of their greatest collaborations was the creation of the first automaton that could truly be called alive. Not merely animated, but genuinely living, possessed of not just artificial intelligence, but actual consciousness. They named her Pandora, the all-gifted, and she would become both their greatest triumph and their most controversial creation. But that story interweaves with greater tales, and for now, we continue with the god who gave her form. The commissions from other gods flowed steadily, each one a challenge that pushed his skills further. For Demeter, grieving the loss of Persephone for half of each year, he created a scythe that could harvest not just grain, but time itself. With it, she could accelerate the growth of crops in times of need, ensuring mortals never starved during her daughter's absence. The blade was forged from metal that had existed before time became linear, its edge sharp enough to cut the bonds between moments. For Dionysus, god of wine and ecstasy, he crafted drinking vessels that could transform any liquid into the finest wine. But these were not simple enchantments. Each cup was calibrated to its user, transforming liquids into exactly the type of wine that would bring joy without destruction. They would refuse to work for those too young, too ill, or already too deep in their cups. It was typical of Hephaestus' later work, power tempered by wisdom, ability balanced with responsibility. For Hermes, messenger of the gods, he created sandals that surpassed even the gods' own winged footwear. These could not just grant speed, but could step between dimensions, allowing travel not just through space, but through layers of reality. They could walk on water, air, or void with equal ease. But they also included safeguards. They would not allow their wearer to venture where they might be destroyed, would always find the path home, would never tire no matter how far they traveled. The workshop on Lemnos became his favorite retreat when Olympus grew too crowded with divine politics and drama. The volcanic island held special meaning for him. It was where he had first touched earth after his fall from heaven, where mortal hands had first shown him kindness before Thetis found him. He established forges there that worked with the volcano's natural rhythms, using the earth's own heartbeat as a power source. The Cyclopes who worked with him on Lemnos were master craftsmen in their own right. Bronze, whose name meant thunder, became his chief assistant. Despite his intimidating size and single eye, his disposition was gentle as a lamb. His hands capable of work so delicate it seemed impossible from someone so large. He had been forging since before Zeus was born, and even Hephaestus could learn from his techniques. Together, they experimented with alloys that shouldn't exist, combining metals in proportions that defied conventional understanding. They discovered that certain metals, when combined under specific conditions, the light of a new moon, the moment between lightning and thunder, the instant when tide turned, would produce materials with properties that transcended their components. These divine alloys became the foundation for artifacts that would shape the age of heroes. The mortal smiths of Lemnos were allowed glimpses of the divine work, though always at a distance that preserved necessary mystery. They would wake from dreams with new techniques burning in their minds, would find their coal producing heat beyond what it should, would discover their hammers striking with uncanny accuracy. The island became known throughout the ancient world for its metalwork, its smiths sought after by kings and heroes alike. But Hephaestus' teaching of mortals was always indirect, always requiring effort to unlock. He understood that knowledge given too freely was not valued, that skills learned without struggle were quickly forgotten. A smith might find a piece of metal worked in an unknown technique and spend years trying to replicate it. In the process, they would discover 3 other techniques, each valuable in its own right. The god taught not just methods, but methodology, not just answers, but how to ask the right questions. The gifts that emerged from his various forges became the seeds of legends. Each was created not just with skill, but with understanding of its destined user. For Achilles, through his mother Thetis' request, he forged armor that was more than mere protection. The process took a full month of constant work, with Thetis herself participating, adding her tears to the quenching bath, singing songs of protection into the metal as it cooled. The shield alone was a cosmos unto itself, round as the sun and nearly as bright. It was made from 5 layers of different metals that had never been combined before: gold from the sun's corona, silver from the moon's tears, bronze from the first weapons ever forged, iron from the earth's heart, and a 5th metal that had no name because it existed nowhere else. On its surface, Hephaestus had wrought not mere decorations, but living scenes that moved and changed. At the center was the earth, surrounded by sea and sky, with the sun and moon and all the constellations. But these were not static representations. The sun moved across the shield's sky, the moon waxed and waned, the constellations wheeled in their eternal dance. Around this central cosmos, in concentric rings that expanded like ripples from a thrown stone, were scenes of mortal life so detailed that observers could lose themselves for hours watching. 2 cities were depicted in full, one at peace and one at war. In the peaceful city, weddings were celebrated with such realism that viewers swore they could hear the marriage songs, smell the roasting meats, feel the joy of the participants. Justice was dispensed in the marketplace, with every legal argument visible to those who looked closely. Children played in streets that seemed to extend beyond the shield's physical dimensions, their laughter almost audible. The warring city showed conflict in all its complexity, not glorified, but revealed in full truth. Soldiers fought with courage and fear in equal measure. Defenders manned walls with determination tinged by doubt. Civilians huddled in homes that might not survive the siege. The gods themselves took sides in the conflict, their presence visible as glowing auras around favored warriors. It was war as it truly was: terrible, necessary, wasteful, and sometimes unavoidable. Between the cities were fields being plowed by oxen, so lifelike that their breath seemed to mist in cold morning air. The plow itself left furrows that deepened as one watched, the soil turning from gold to rich brown as it was worked. Harvesters labored in grain fields that rippled with metallic wheat, their scythes leaving swaths that would regrow by the next viewing. A vineyard heavy with clusters of grapes showed every stage of winemaking, from planting to harvest to the joy of drinking. But perhaps most wondrous was the ocean that rimmed the shield's edge, containing every creature that swam in divine or mortal seas. Whales breached in slow motion, their songs vibrating through the metal. Schools of fish moved in patterns that spelled out prophecies in languages forgotten before human speech began. Ships sailed these metal waters, their crews visible to divine eyes, forever journeying to destinations they would never reach. But somehow, never minding the eternal voyage, the armor itself was no less wondrous. The breastplate was forged from star metal that had never known earthly corruption, decorated with scenes from Achilles' future glory that only he could see clearly. The greaves were made from silver that would never tarnish, that would turn aside any blow aimed below the knee. The helmet was crowned with a plume of golden fire that would burn without heat, striking fear into enemies while inspiring allies. But Hephaestus, knowing Thetis' prophecy about her son's fate, built into the armor a cruel mercy. It was perfect protection everywhere except one spot, the heel, where mortality must retain its claim. This was not oversight, but intention. For without the possibility of death, there could be no true heroism. The armor would make Achilles nearly invincible, but that nearly was what would make his choices matter. For Perseus, tasked with slaying Medusa, the gifts were simpler, but no less perfect. The sword, named Harp, was forged from metal that had never known the earth, or gathered from fallen stars over centuries. It was worked in forges that burned with the cold fire of void between stars, quenched in water drawn from the river Styx itself. The resulting blade could cut through not just physical matter, but through the bonds of magic itself, through curses and enchantments, as easily as through flesh. The shield he provided was polished to mirror perfection. But this was no ordinary reflection. It showed truth rather than mere image, revealing the reality behind appearances. When Perseus used it to view Medusa, he would see not just her snake-haired horror, but the beautiful woman she had been, the tragedy of her transformation, the pain behind the petrifying gaze. It was typical of Hephaestus' gifts, providing what was needed while adding layers of meaning that the user might not discover until later. The story of Pandora showed another facet of his skill entirely. When Zeus commanded him to create the first woman as a beautiful curse upon mankind, Hephaestus approached the task with the same dedication he brought to all his work, but also with a subversive creativity that the thunder god didn't anticipate. He understood Zeus' intent to punish humanity for accepting Prometheus' gift of fire. But he also understood that creation, once begun, follows its own laws. He shaped her from clay mixed with water from every sacred spring in Greece, giving her a connection to the land itself that would pass to all her descendants. But as he worked, he made choices that would have far-reaching consequences. Into the clay, he mixed other elements, tears of joy to give her capacity for happiness, honey to make her words sweet, iron filings to give her will strength, gold dust to make her precious beyond measure. The forming took days, as he sculpted not just a body, but a vessel for consciousness. Every proportion was perfect, but it was the imperfections he included that made her human, a tiny scar on one finger that would make her real to touch, a slight asymmetry in her smile that would make it genuine, a way of tilting her head when thinking that would make her thoughts seem worth waiting for. When it came time to breathe life into her, he did more than required. Yes, he gave her beauty as commanded, but it was beauty that went beyond mere appearance. It was the beauty of potential, of possibility, of change itself given form. He breathed into her not just life, but curiosity, not just existence, but the drive to understand existence. He gave her hands that would itch to open things, eyes that would seek to see beyond surfaces, a mind that would always ask why and what if. Each god and goddess contributed to her creation as Zeus commanded, but Hephaestus ensured their gifts would interact in ways they didn't expect. Athena taught her weaving and domestic arts, but Hephaestus made sure she would understand not just the techniques, but the principles behind them, the mathematics of thread becoming cloth, the engineering of loom and spindle. She would not just follow patterns, but create new ones. Aphrodite gave her grace and the power to inspire desire, but Hephaestus tempered this with a core of steel that would let her resist being merely an object of desire. Her beauty would draw others, yes, but her spirit would determine what happened next. She would have the power to choose, to reject, to define herself rather than be defined by others' wants. Hermes gave her cunning and persuasive speech, but Hephaestus ensured she would have thoughts worth speaking, ideas that could change minds rather than just manipulate them. Her words would carry weight because they would carry truth, even when that truth was wrapped in necessary deception. She would lie, as all humans would, but her lies would serve purposes beyond mere self-interest. The jar later mistranslated as a box that she would carry was also his creation, and into it he poured all his understanding of necessity and hope. It was made from ceramic so fine it was nearly transparent, allowing glimpses of the contents without revealing their true nature. The outside was decorated with scenes that warned of its contents in a language of symbols that predated words, images that spoke directly to the subconscious about danger and desire. The lid was sealed with 7 different types of locks, each requiring not just a key, but an understanding to open. The first lock would yield to curiosity, the second to determination, the third to courage, the fourth to foolishness, the fifth to wisdom, the sixth to desperation, and the seventh to hope itself. That Pandora would eventually open all 7 was inevitable. Hephaestus had made her curious, after all. But the journey through each lock would teach her what it meant to be human. Inside, he placed all the ills that Zeus demanded: disease, death, pain, sorrow, and all their kin. But he crafted each one carefully, understanding that even ills serve purposes. Disease would teach the value of health, death would make life precious, pain would make pleasure meaningful, sorrow would make joy possible. They were not punishments, but teachers, harsh ones perhaps, but necessary for humans to become fully themselves. And at the bottom, weighted differently than all the rest, he placed hope. But this was not the fragile thing that mortals would imagine. It was hope forged like metal, tempered in fires of despair, quenched in tears of joy, polished with the breath of every prayer ever uttered. It was hope that could survive anything, that would renew itself no matter how often it was crushed, that would always be there for those who sought it. When Pandora opened the jar, as was inevitable, the ills escaped as Zeus intended. They spread across the world like smoke, finding every human habitation, ensuring that mortality would never know the careless ease of the golden age again. But hope remained, not because it was trapped, but because it chose to stay, to be found by each person individually, rather than imposed universally. This was Hephaestus' gift to humanity, hidden within Zeus' curse, the promise that no matter how dark things became, hope would endure. His workshops expanded beyond Olympus and Lemnos to other places of power. In Sicily, beneath Mount Etna, he established perhaps his grandest forge complex. Here the mountain itself became part of his workshop, its regular eruptions providing not just heat, but rhythm. The chambers he carved went deeper than mortal understanding, reaching layers of the earth where pressure and temperature created conditions impossible to replicate elsewhere. The Cyclopes who worked in the Etna forges were different from those on Lemnos older, more primal, speaking in languages that predated human speech. They were the sons of Gaia herself, born when the earth was young and mountains were still learning to be solid. They worked with techniques passed down from the Titans, from the time when the world was still cooling from its creation. Steropes, whose name meant lightning, could see the future in the flames, reading omens in the way metal cooled. His prophecies were always about creation and destruction, about things that would be made and unmade. Pyracmon, the hammer-bearer, had arms that never tired, that could strike the same spot 1,000 times without variance. His rhythm became the heartbeat of the forge, setting the pace for all work done there. Together with these ancient helpers, Hephaestus forged items too powerful or too dangerous for his other workshops. Chains that could bind concepts were wrought in chambers so deep that the weight of the world above helped compress them into solidity. Weapons that could wound ideas themselves were tempered in fires that burned with the memory of the universe's birth, in flames that had never known extinction. The golden robots he created became more sophisticated with each iteration. What had begun as simple automation evolved into beings that bordered on true artificial life. They developed not just personalities, but relationships, friendships, and rivalries and alliances. They created their own language, a musical tongue of chimes and harmonics that could express concepts no verbal language could capture. Some specialized in particular crafts, becoming masters in their own right. One golden maiden became expert at working with fabric woven from moonbeams, creating cloth that could only be seen in certain lights. Another learned to forge silence itself, creating zones of perfect quiet that could muffle even divine speech. A bronze giant developed the ability to work with time as a material, creating objects that aged backwards or existed in multiple moments simultaneously. They began to create things on their own initiative, small items at first, a gear that turned more smoothly, a hinge that never squeaked, a surface treatment that prevented tarnish. But as their sophistication grew, so did their ambitions. They would present Hephaestus with innovations he hadn't imagined, solutions to problems he hadn't recognized. The forge became not just his workshop, but theirs, a collaborative space where creation happened at multiple levels. Among his most satisfying work were the gifts he made for mortals who showed kindness to the disabled or different. These were never commissioned, never requested. He simply became aware of their stories through the complex networks of prayer and gossip that connected divine and mortal realms, and he acted. The gifts always appeared to be chance finds or natural occurrences, but those wise enough to look closely could see the divine craftsmanship. For a blind potter whose work surpassed that of sighted craftsmen, he created clay that would sing its readiness, that would guide hands to where they were needed. The potter's work, already excellent, became transcendent, creating vessels that seemed to hold light within their walls, that would never crack or leak, that made whatever they contained taste better. The potter never knew the origin of the miraculous clay, but honored it by never wasting a single handful. For a lame shepherd boy who had been mocked by his peers, but had shown kindness to injured animals, he created a staff that would always find the safest path. It appeared to be a simple fallen branch, but it would grow warm when danger approached, would extend or shorten to provide perfect support, would strike with unexpected force if its bearer was threatened. More than that, it made the boy's lameness irrelevant. With the staff, he could traverse terrain that challenged even the able-bodied. For a deaf musician who felt music through vibrations rather than hearing it, he created instruments that projected their sound as visible light, allowing her to see the music she created. Her performances became legendary, combining sound and light in ways that enchanted all who witnessed them. She never questioned where the instruments came from, accepting them as gifts from the muses, never knowing it was the smith god who understood that disability was just difference, not diminishment. His relationship with Athena deepened over the centuries into something unique among Olympian dynamics. They were neither lovers nor rivals, but something rarer, true collaborators. When they worked together, the boundaries between their domains blurred. Craft became wisdom. Wisdom became tangible. They pushed each other to exceed their individual limits, creating things that neither could have achieved alone. Their greatest collaboration before Pandora was the creation of the first chariot. Athena designed it with mathematical precision, understanding the physics of motion the geometry of speed, the calculus of turning forces. Hephaestus built it, translating her abstract principles into wood and metal and leather. But in the building, he added touches she hadn't envisioned: wheels that would repair themselves, axles that would never need grease, a body that was light as air but strong as mountains. Together, they solved problems that had puzzled both. How to make reins that would communicate with horses without cruelty, creating understanding rather than mere control. How to design wheels that could run on any surface: sand, stone, water, or air. How to balance speed with safety, creating vehicles that could race like wind but would never throw their drivers. The chariot they created became the template for all that followed, but none quite matched the perfection of the original. The story circulated by some mortals of his attempted assault on Athena was a corruption of a deeper truth. He had indeed desired her, but it was not base lust that moved him. What he desired was the perfect collaboration they achieved, the meeting of minds that occurred when they worked together. He dreamed of making that temporary unity permanent, of joining not just in work, but in being. When he approached her with this feeling, she understood immediately. Her rejection was gentle, but firm. Their partnership was already perfect in its current form. To change it would be to diminish it, like alloying gold with a baser metal. They were better as independent forces that chose to work together than as a fused unit that had no choice. She helped him understand that some hungers were better left unfed, that some desires found their best fulfillment in remaining desires. From his spilled seed on that occasion came Erychthonius, born from the earth itself, where divine essence met mortal soil. Hephaestus accepted responsibility immediately, seeing in this strange birth an echo of his own unusual origins. The child was marked like his father, serpent-tailed, where Hephaestus was lame-footed, different in ways that would have horrified mortals, but that the smith god saw as simply another form of being. With Athena's help, for she felt some responsibility for the child's existence, he raised Erychthonius to be both craftsman and king. The boy learned the forge and the throne room, understanding that making and ruling were related arts. Under their tutelage, he became one of the great early kings of Athens, establishing traditions of craft and wisdom that would endure for millennia. He was perhaps the closest Hephaestus came to traditional fatherhood, and he threw himself into it with the same dedication he brought to his craft. As ages passed and the world changed, Hephaestus adapted his craft to new realities. When the age of heroes gave way to the age of philosophy, he created less armor and more instruments of understanding, astrolabes that could track not just the movements of celestial bodies, but the flow of ideas across cultures, writing implements that would never run dry, and that would help clarify the thoughts of those who used them, devices for measuring and understanding the natural world that would would inspire mortal inventors for generations. He began creating tools for peace as enthusiastically as he had once forged weapons for war, plows that would never dull, and that would make even rocky soil fertile, looms that would guide weavers to create patterns they hadn't imagined, medical instruments that would help healers see inside bodies without cutting, understand illness without causing pain. Each tool carried within it not just function, but teaching, showing mortals possibilities they could then pursue with their own skills. When warfare evolved from bronze to iron to steel, he stayed ahead of the curve, developing alloys and techniques that mortals would not discover on their own for centuries. But he also developed countermeasures, ensuring that no weapon became too dominant. For every sword, a shield. For every siege engine, a wall that could withstand it. He understood that balance was necessary, that absolute power in any hands led to corruption. The volcano that mortals call Etna became more than just a workshop. It became a second home, in chambers carved from living rock, surrounded by rivers of lava that flowed in carefully directed channels. He found a peace that eluded him on Olympus. Here he could work without interruption, could experiment without observation, could fail without judgment. The mountain's constant activity provided both power and companionship. Its rumblings, a conversation in a language only he fully understood. Sometimes he would work for months on a single project, the mountain smoking constantly, lava fountains playing like water features in a garden. Other times, he would complete dozens of smaller items in rapid succession. The mountain, quiet, except for the ring of hammer on anvil that could be heard by those who knew how to listen. The rhythm of his work became the rhythm of the mountain. Or perhaps it was Flanders' other way around. The mountain learning to breathe in time with its divine inhabitant. His creations found their way into mortal hands through countless paths. Sometimes heroes would receive them as gifts for service to the gods. Sometimes they would be discovered in ancient ruins, still functional after centuries of abandonment. Sometimes they would appear precisely when needed most, as if the forge god maintained some cosmic awareness of where his works were required. Each item carried with it a piece of its creator's essence, not his consciousness, but his principles. The mysteries of metallurgy that he passed to mortals came through dreams and inspiration rather than direct teaching. A smith working late would suddenly understand how carbon and iron could dance together to create steel. A jeweler would dream of new ways to cut gems that would reveal hidden fires within. A potter would discover glazes that produced colors never seen before. Always the knowledge came in ways that required work to implement, ensuring that mortals valued what they learned. He took special interest in smiths who worked despite disabilities, who found ways around limitations to create beauty. To them, he was especially generous with inspiration. showing them techniques that turned their disabilities into advantages. A one-armed smith might discover a way of working that required only one hand, but produced results superior to traditional two-handed techniques. A smith with failing eyesight might develop a way of judging temperature by sound that was more accurate than visual observation. In his quieter moments, when the forge was banked and the automation moved in maintenance patterns that required no supervision, Hephaestus would sometimes create purely for the joy of creation. These pieces had no purpose beyond existence, no function except to be beautiful. Small figures that danced when touched by moonlight, moving in patterns that told wordless stories, flowers of silver that bloomed in response to music, each petal tuned to a different note, creating harmonies with their movement. He created crystals that captured and replayed moments of perfect happiness, not the entire scene, but just the emotion, pure and undiluted. Anyone who held one would feel for a moment the exact joy that had been captured, whether it was a child's laughter, a lover's first kiss, or the satisfaction of completed work. These he rarely showed to anyone, storing them in private vaults deep within his forge, waiting for moments when they would be needed. There were also his failed experiments, though even his failures were often more wondrous than other successes. A helmet that granted the wearer the ability to understand any language, but understanding brought with it the emotional weight of the words, making harsh speech physically painful. A mirror that showed not just truth, but all possible truths, driving viewers mad with infinite alternatives. A sword that would cut only in defense of the innocent, but who determined innocence. These he kept in a special vault, not destroyed, but set aside, waiting for the time when their flaws might become features. He understood that failure was just another kind of success, teaching what didn't work and pointing toward what might. Every failed experiment narrowed the path to eventual triumph. Every mistake was a guidepost saying, not this way, try another. His lameness, that mark of his fall from Olympus, had long since ceased to be a source of shame. He had transformed it, as he transformed everything he touched, from limitation into strength. The supports and braces he crafted for himself were marvels that drew even Athena's admiration. They adjusted automatically to different terrains, provided exactly the support needed for whatever task he undertook, could even interface with his tools to provide additional stability or force when needed. More than physical support, they had become part of his identity. His rolling gait, once awkward, had become a dance of efficiency. Young smiths would imitate it, thinking it held some secret of balance or rhythm. In a way, they were right. It was the rhythm of one who had learned to work with what was rather than rage against what wasn't, who had transformed impediment into advantage. When he walked through his forge, his disability disappeared into the larger grace of purpose. He moved with the certainty of one who knew every tool's location every surface's height, every flame's temperature. Visitors often forgot his lameness entirely, remembering only the smooth efficiency of his movements, the way he flowed from task to task like water, finding its level. This understanding of limitation as opportunity infused all his work. Every tool he made acknowledged that users were not perfect, that hands grew tired, that attention wandered, that mistakes happened. His tools compensated, supported, enhanced. A hammer that would never strike a thumb, no matter how tired the wielder. Tongs that would grip with exactly the right pressure, preventing both dropping and crushing. Measures that would remember their settings, allowing work to resume after interruption without loss of precision. The relationship between Hephaestus and fire evolved from master and tool to something approaching partnership or even identity. He didn't command fire so much as commune with it, understanding its nature so deeply that the boundary between smith and flame became permeable. He could reach into forge fire without burning, not because he was immune, but because the fire recognized him and chose not to harm. Each type of fire had its own personality, its own preferences, its own gifts to offer. Forge fire was steady and reliable, the working class hero of flames. It wanted to help, to be useful, to transform raw material into finished goods. Volcanic fire was wilder, more primal, remembering the earth's violent birth and eager to recreate that first moment of creation. Star fire was alien and pure, burning with frequencies that mortal eyes couldn't see, capable of changes that normal physics wouldn't allow. He learned to speak to each type in its own language. To forge fire, he spoke in rhythms of bellows and the ring of hammers. To volcanic fire, he spoke in the deep grumblings of tectonic movement and the explosive joy of eruption. To star fire, he spoke in mathematics and music, in the harmonies of spheres and the equations of fusion. Each responded to his will because he understood their nature, worked with them rather than against them. This connection to fire extended to its metaphorical forms. The fire of inspiration that burned in artists' minds, the flame of passion that consumed lovers, the spark of life that animated all beings. These two fell within his influence. He could kindle creativity in a blocked artist with a thought, could bank the flames of destructive obsession before they consumed their host, could nurture the tiny spark of interest into the bonfire of dedication. But he used this power sparingly, understanding that mortals needed to tend their own fires. Too much divine intervention, and the flames would burn hollow, producing light without heat, appearance without substance. Instead, he provided the tools, literal and metaphorical, that allowed mortals to manage their own internal fires. A painter's brush that would never muddy colors might free them to focus on vision. A writer's pen that never ran dry might allow thoughts to flow uninterrupted. Always the gift was support, not substitution. His influence on mortal civilization was incalculable, but often invisible. Every advancement in metallurgy could trace its roots back to his inspiration. Every improvement in tools, from the simplest hammer to the most complex mechanism, bore his implicit blessing. But more than physical technologies, he influenced the very concept of craft, the idea that patient work and skill could transform the world. The guilds of smiths that formed in various cultures all unknowingly followed patterns he had established. The relationship between master and apprentice echoed his teaching methods, showing rather than telling, guiding rather than commanding, allowing failure as a teacher. The progression from simple to complex tasks mirrored his own development. Even the smith's traditional place at the edge of settlements, necessary, but slightly apart, reflected his position among the gods. The rituals that surrounded smith work, the lighting of the forge with ceremony, the quenching of blades at specific times, the songs sung while working, all had roots in divine practice. Mortal smiths who performed these rituals without understanding their origin still benefited from them. The ceremonies created the proper mental state for creation. The songs helped maintain rhythm. The timing aligned work with cosmic forces that aided transformation. As the ages turned and the direct rule of gods gave way to more subtle influence, Hephaestus adapted again. He no longer appeared directly to mortals, but worked through inspiration and dream. A smith would wake with a new technique burning in their mind. An inventor would suddenly understand how separate parts could work together. An artist would see possibilities in materials they had overlooked. Always the inspiration felt natural, arising from within rather than imposed from without. He began preparing for the time when gods would withdraw even further, when mortals would have to stand entirely on their own. Into his creations, he embedded lessons that would unfold over time. A tool might work simply at first, but reveal additional capabilities as its user's skill grew. A technique might have applications beyond its original purpose, waiting to be discovered by curious minds. He was teaching mortals to teach themselves, giving them the capability for independent growth. The forge beneath Olympus remained active even as the gods themselves became less so. While others slept through centuries or played endless games, Hephaestus worked. He created items for futures. He could see coming tools that would be needed in ages yet to be, solutions to problems that didn't yet exist. His storerooms filled with wonders waiting for their time, patient as their creator. Some of these future gifts were straightforward, improved plows. For when populations grew and agriculture needed to become more efficient, others were more abstract devices that would help mortals understand the very small and very large preparation. For when their curiosity would extend beyond the immediately visible, all were designed to appear when needed, to be discovered or invented by mortals who had prepared themselves through study and dedication. He also began creating what he called seed artifacts, items that contained within them the inspiration for entire fields of study, a lens that would lead to understanding of optics, a gear mechanism that would inspire mechanical engineering, a chemical reaction preserved in crystal that would spark interest in the transformation of matter. These seeds would lie dormant until the right mind encountered them, then bloom into entire disciplines of knowledge. The other gods noticed his constant activity, but rarely commented on it. They had their own concerns, their own games of power and pleasure. That Hephaestus chose to spend eternity working was seen as just another divine eccentricity. They didn't understand that for him, creation was not labor, but joy, not obligation, but choice. Every strike of his hammer was an affirmation. Every completed project a small victory over entropy. Aphrodite's visits to his forge became less frequent as the ages passed, but they never ceased entirely. She would appear at unexpected times, drawn perhaps by some particularly beautiful creation, or simply by the desire for the unique peace his workshop provided. Their marriage had evolved from awkward arrangement to comfortable understanding. They were not lovers in any conventional sense, but they were partners in the dance of beauty and creation. Sometimes she would bring him challenges. Could he create beauty that didn't rely on form? Could he make something that was ugly to look at but beautiful in function? Could he forge an item that would teach the nature of beauty to those who used it? He would accept these challenges with the same seriousness he brought to divine commissions, understanding that she was pushing him to expand his art. Their collaborations produced some of his most interesting work. A mirror that showed not physical appearance, but the beauty of character. Jewelry that enhanced not the wearer's looks, but their confidence. Tools that made the act of creation itself beautiful, regardless of the outcome. Through these projects, they explored the intersection of their domains, finding common ground in the pursuit of perfection, differently defined. The relationship with other gods evolved as well. Ares, god of war, initially dismissed Hephaestus as a mere craftsman. But as conflicts became more complex, as warfare evolved from simple clash of bronze to strategic deployment of technology, he came to value the smith's contributions. The two developed an odd friendship based on mutual respect for expertise. Ares understood battle. Hephaestus understood the tools of battle. Together, they could analyze conflict in ways neither could alone. Apollo, god of arts, became a regular visitor to the forge. He was fascinated by the intersection of craft and art, by the way Hephaestus could make functional items that were also beautiful. They would have long discussions about the nature of creativity, about whether there was a difference between making and creating, between craft and art. These conversations often lasted days, accompanied by the rhythm of hammer on anvil and the melodies of Apollo's lyre. Even Zeus, king of gods, came to rely on Hephaestus more than he might have admitted. The thunderbolts that were his primary weapons needed regular maintenance and occasional replacement. The mechanisms that kept Olympus functioning, the ambrosia fountains, the nectar distilleries, the barriers that kept mortals from accidentally wandering into divine spaces, all required the smith's attention. Zeus might rule, but Hephaestus maintained the infrastructure that made rule possible. As we near the end of our tale, though in truth, the story of creation has no end, we find ourselves contemplating the eternal nature of making. Hephaestus, alone among the gods, never sought worship for its own sake. His temples were workshops, his prayers were the ring of hammers, his offerings were the dedication of craftsmen to their craft. He wanted not supplicants, but fellow makers, not worshippers, but workers. In every mortal who has ever felt the satisfaction of creation, who has known the joy of bringing something new into the world, there burns a spark of his divine fire. The carpenter shaping wood, the potter forming clay, the poet forging words, the programmer crafting code, all participate in the same fundamental act that Hephaestus represents. They transform the potential into the actual, the imagined into the real, the needed into the existing. The smoke from his forge rises still through all his various workshops, carrying with it the dreams of makers everywhere. It mingles with smoke from mortal forges, creating a communion between divine and human creativity. In the smoke are carried prayers that are not spoken, but enacted, the prayer of dedication, of patience, of skill slowly developed and carefully applied. His automation continues their work even when he rests, maintaining the rhythm of creation that has become fundamental to reality itself. They have evolved beyond his original design, becoming creators in their own right. Some say that in the deepest parts of his forge, they have begun creating their own helpers, that the chain of making extends into infinity. Creation creating creators who created is a fitting legacy for the God who brought purpose to matter. The failed experiments in his vaults wait patiently for their time. What seems like failure in one age becomes necessity in another. The helmet that made all speech painful might be perfect for an age that needs to learn the weight of words. The mirror that shows all possibilities might be essential when choices become too complex for single perspectives. Even failures are just successes waiting for their context. And Hephaestus himself, he works on, patient as stone, persistent as water, enduring as fire. Each day brings new challenges, new materials, new possibilities. The joy he found as a child arranging shells in the underwater palace has never faded. If anything, it has deepened with age and expertise. He knows more, can do more, understands more, but the fundamental satisfaction of making remains as fresh as ever. Sometimes, when the forge is quiet and the only sound is the settling of cooling metal, he remembers his fall from Olympus. not with bitterness. That emotion burned away long ago in forge fires, but with something approaching gratitude. Without that fall, would he have found his true nature? Without that rejection, would he have discovered acceptance in creation? Without that pain, would he have learned to transform suffering into strength? He thinks of Thetis and Eurynome, his foster mothers of the sea, with warmth that time cannot diminish. They saved not just his life, but his spirit, showing him that kindness existed even in the depths, that beauty could be found in the strangest places. The pearl Thetis gave him still rests in a place of honor in his forge, and sometimes he can hear in it the echo of every wave, the memory of unconditional acceptance. The gods may fade. Already mortals remember them more as stories than realities. But what Hephaestus represents cannot fade. As long as there are those who see raw material and imagine what it could become, as long as there are hands willing to work and minds willing to learn, as long as the transformation of idea into object continues, his influence endures. He needs no temples because every workshop is his temple. He needs no priests because every craftsperson is his priest. Now, as our tale draws to its close, as Morpheus spreads his gentle wings across the world and prepares to guide you into the realm of dreams, we leave you with the image of the eternal forge, somewhere in the space between myth and reality, between the possible and the actual. The fires still burn. The hammer still rises and falls in rhythms older than human memory. The act of creation continues, will always continue, must continue. For it is creation that holds back chaos, that brings meaning from randomness, that transforms the universe from what it is into what it could be. Let the sound of that distant hammering be your lullaby tonight. Let the warm glow of forge fire light your path into sleep. In your dreams, you may find yourself in a workshop of your own imagining, where the tools fit perfectly in your hands and materials bend willingly to your intent. You may discover that you too carry the spark of divine creation, that your hands know secrets your waking mind has forgotten. The rhythm of the bellows becomes the rhythm of your breathing, slow and steady and sustaining. The ring of hammer on anvil becomes your heartbeat, regular and strong. The hiss of hot metal meeting water becomes the whisper of sleep approaching, transformation beginning. You are not just falling asleep, but being remade, reformed, renewed in the forge of dreams. Remember that every morning brings the chance to create anew. Every day is a blank piece of metal waiting to be shaped. Every moment a spark that could kindle something wonderful. You carry within you the same force that drives Hephaestus, the urge to make, to improve, to bring beauty and function into the world. Your materials may differ, your tools may vary, but the essential act remains the same. The stars wheel overhead in patterns as precise as any mechanism, following paths that Hephaestus helped forge in the universe's youth. The moon follows her course with the reliability of divine clockwork, marking time for those who work and those who rest, and in forges both mythical and real, both divine and mortal. The work continues patient, persistent, eternal. As sleep takes you, as consciousness transforms into dream, remember that you are part of the great work. Every problem solved, everything improved, every moment of beauty created adds to the sum total of creation in the universe. You are not just a listener to this tale, but a participant in its continuation. Tomorrow you will wake and face the world anew, carrying within you the spark that connects you to all makers throughout time. The God of the forge watches over all who create, all who craft, all who dare to say this could be better, and then work to make it so. In the realm of dreams, anything can be forged, any material shaped, any impossibility resolved. Let your sleeping mind play in this workshop of infinite possibility, trying combinations that waking logic would forbid, creating wonders that daylight might dissolve, but whose essence will remain. Rest now in the warmth of creative fire, in the security of divine craftsmanship, in the knowledge that somewhere, always, the forge burns bright. Let the ancient rhythms carry you deeper into sleep, the breath of bellows, the song of metal, the whisper of flame. You are held in the workshop of dreams, where all things are possible and creation never ceases. The story ends as all stories must, but the craft continues eternal. In that continuation, we find our own small immortality, not in lasting forever, but in adding our verse to the endless song of making. Sleep well, dream deeply, and wake, refreshed to continue the great work. The forge awaits, the tools are ready, and tomorrow holds infinite possibility for those with the courage to create. May your dreams be filled with the satisfaction of work well done, the joy of problems solved, the beauty of potential realized, and may you wake knowing that you too are a maker, a shaper, a bringer of new things into the world. The legacy of Hephaestus lives not in temples or prayers, but in every act of creation, every moment of making, every transformation of what is into what could be. Sleep now, held in the warmth of eternal fires, lulled by the rhythm of divine craftsmanship, secure in the knowledge that creation continues always, that beauty emerges from dedication, that even gods honor those who work with patience and skill. The forge of dreams awaits, and in it anything is possible. Rest well, Creator. Tomorrow, the great work